Hello, world. Welcome to the Speed Strength Show. I'm Tommy.
And I'm Braden. And one too many or one too few? Um, to clarify, like in certain situations, you'd rather have too much money and too little debt. Like that's obvious. But in some situations, and I had this thought with regards to like sprinting and jump training and things like that. If you do one too few reps and you don't hit that peak, then you're not getting the full benefit. If you do one too many, that's potentially like pulling down your performance a little bit. So both sides of it are a little bit negative. And I guess the question is, in which direction are you comfortable being wrong?
I'd rather be one too few.
Interesting. Interesting. Why is that?
I'm going to paraphrase this quote from Dan Paff, and it's something to the extent of he'd rather be a mile short than an inch over. When he was talking about like training loads with people and the injury risk, right? So everyone, we're talking sprinting, we're talking jumping, things like that. You always get hurt on the last one.
Well, because that's when you stop if you get hurt.
Yeah. And so I think the idea behind this, he'd rather be a mile short than an inch over, is I would rather leave a little bit on the table and have the person be healthy than go just a touch too far and then you ruin something and then that person's on the DL now as a result. So if you're talking a training perspective in terms of like volume or pushing the intensity and things like that, I'd rather be one too few and do less better than do one extra one that maybe we didn't need to do and then something bad happens.
Interesting. That's a good argument there. I hadn't thought about it that way. My thought was always, if you do one too many, you know that you hit the peak. But if you do one too few, like, is that actually one too few, or like, is that four too few?
Oh, like, did you actually get to where you want, like the
Yeah,
output that you wanted?
yeah, and then in this scenario, like, you're assuming yes, but in reality, you don't actually know. Like, you hit the peak if you start to slow down, but if you're still getting faster, you don't know if you hit the peak or not.
That's also a good point.
Mm-hmm. So that was my thought process. But with regards to training, I mean, safety is always important. So that's a very good way to think about it.
So yeah, I think that would be my gut instinct, is to do one too few rather than one too many.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'd rather have that person be able to live to lift another day.
Mm-hmm.
And be like, hey, we did 5 today. We maybe could have done 6, but we got a good session in. You stayed healthy. We can come back tomorrow or 2 days from now, whenever it is, and take care of business again.
Do you think that thought process would apply to other areas, like not just training? So I guess it's that all the examples are really like specific, but I have two other examples. So if you're baking and like you don't necessarily have the recipe in front of you or measuring cups or whatever, but like you eyeball, this is a good amount of flour.
Ooh.
But you're not quite sure. Are you more likely to add a little bit more or take a little bit away? So that's one example. The other example could be like if you're studying for something, and you could study, like, are you more likely to not study quite enough or study a little bit too much and be like overtired or start to get confused or something like that?
Oh, the study one, I always did the minimum.
Yeah. Okay. Same.
Like, I would rather go to bed. Like, if you compare the classic, like somebody trying to pull an all-nighter to cram all the info
Mm-hmm.
and then write the test in the morning, I was always the person that I'll do what I can up until 10 or 11 o'clock at night. And then I'm going to bed. I'm going to get my 8 or 9 hours and I'm going to write it in a good place tomorrow, rather than, oh, I stayed up all night trying to cram the information. That doesn't work for me. The
Yeah.
baking one, I don't know, man. Baking's a science.
Yeah. Well, yeah,
Baking's
I
a
know.
science, cooking's an art.
Yeah.
And
So you might just throw out
I
the
don't,
whole thing out if you don't have a recipe.
yeah, does it matter with baking? Like if you put in a little too much flour or not enough, wouldn't it screw it up either way, I think?
I mean, that's the whole thing. Like that's the whole question is like which direction are you comfortable screwing it up in? You know?
I don't know if that applies. The problem is I don't know if that applies for baking.
Yeah, I mean, maybe not.
Because at
I mean,
least with like the studying example, in one of those cases, the person who pulls the all-nighter probably has a better understanding of the info. Like they've had the
yeah,
chance to see more of it,
yeah,
but it's at the downside of maybe not being physically and mentally feeling great because you got a terrible sleep.
yeah,
Versus the other way, it's inverse, is where baking, if you have too little of an ingredient and it turns out like crap, but you have too much of an ingredient and it turns out like crap, is either the like, do you want to
yeah,
eat those cookies or the cake or whatever it was you were baking afterwards? Maybe not.
yeah. I guess potentially they're equally bad. I mean, you would say like in one direction it's maybe more dry, and in the other direction it's maybe more like undercooked or whatever. Um,
Still not appealing though.
no, it's not.
Like
It's
neither of
not.
those, none of those are jumping out at me like, oh yeah, I would like to eat a really dry, piece of bread or cookie.
Yeah,
Or
no, that's
maybe an undercooked cookie wouldn't be the end of the world because cookie dough tastes pretty good.
that's true.
But like a cake or something like that, if it was undercooked, it would be like, this is kind of gross.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. The studying one I think makes more sense, is more applicable anyway. I was always kind of the same way, not necessarily like the all-nighter thing, but um, I would always get to the point where like I've went through everything once or twice. I have a reasonable grasp on the information. I know I'm going to pass. I'll probably get like a 70, 75. Um, for me to get into the 80s, I know I'm going to have to put in like another 5 or 6 hours of studying, and that's just not worth it to me. So I'm comfortable where I am, and we'll just let the chips fall where they may.
Yeah, I was the same way.
Yeah.
I also felt like too, if you didn't get a good night's sleep, like you might have looked at all the info and then you're just too tired to try to recall it and remember what it was.
Yeah, that's right.
As
That's
where
right.
at
Like I
least if you spent less time studying, the things that you studied, you remember those. And then the things that you didn't
mhm.
study, you're like, well, if a question comes up on that, I guess.
Yeah. And I mean, you presumably sat through all the classes anyway, so like you've seen it all. You have seen it all. And
Exactly.
if you're more alert, then maybe like subconsciously your brain's like, it's this one. You feel like it's this one. And you don't
Especially if
know.
you write the exam in the same room that you had the class in and you get the contextual learning effect.
Did you notice that helped you? I haven't I don't remember that helping me
I
at all.
haven't noticed, but research has shown if you learn something, what was that study and they did where people had to memorize a list of words and some people were underwater and some people were above water. And then they had them switch. And then the people who remembered the words underwater or learned the words underwater initially had an easier time recalling all the words underwater. It was something super bizarre like that.
I've never heard of that. That's crazy.
Because I remember for motor learning, our prof was like, oh, I hope that being in a different classroom doesn't throw you off because of all the contextual learning we talked about. And I was like, oh, thanks a lot. Now I'm going to think about that. I'm not going to remember as much for this test.
Oh man, that's funny. No, I've never heard of that. I've
So,
never heard of
but
that.
I don't know if it's real or not. And I did all right in that class. So
I mean, it
I don't
must be.
think writing in
If
a different room hurt me that much. But
if they studied it, then it must be. But I think the environment can give you, because like your senses are working all the time, right? So um like a smell will bring you back to like a specific place, or like I get this, like a song reminds me of a specific time or activity, um or whatever, so if you have like, if you see a word on the page, and then you're like, oh yeah, I was looking over here when the prof said that, and then you look there and
exactly.
it's like, oh yeah, now I remember what he said.
Yeah. Now you're like, oh, this is brilliant. And you start writing it down. You're like, I'm going to get this question right.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, in terms of training, I would say I'd rather do one too few than one too many, personally.
Yeah, I think that's smart. If you're talking about injury risk, that's definitely smart. Um, I always remembered learning, like Stu talked about it with some Russian lifter in the 80s, probably.
There's always a
And
Russian.
well, I feel like I've heard you talk about it or somebody else, maybe like with regards to Charlie Francis and Ben Johnson, that like with fast stuff or powerful stuff, whenever like you don't necessarily need to have a rep scheme, you just do it, and as long as it's good, then you keep doing it, and if it's bad, then you stop. Um, so in that sense, it's like you go until you slow down, or you go until you don't throw it as far or whatever. Um, so that was kind of the thought process that I took forward. But anyway, that feeds in nicely to what we're talking about today.
Oh, big time.
Plyos part 2 / the shock method part 1, because we didn't say that last time.
Yeah, well, that was one thing we were talking about is that, yeah, if anyone went and looked up the stuff from Verkhoshansky, the plyometrics was coined by, I think it was an American dude. I think his first name was Wilt or his last name was Wilt or something. I don't know the guy's name, but someone went over and saw Verkhoshansky's training and then brought the term plyometrics back to North America, which is why we tend to call it plyometrics. But if you read his original work, he called it the shock method. So shock method and the plyos we are talking about, same thing.
Do you think they still call it the shock method in Russia?
Probably. And I mean, his daughter still refers to it as, like, when she gives presentations and stuff like that, still calls it the shock method. So I can't remember where I read it. It might have been in Super Training, or it might have been in another book where I think that Verkhoshansky talked about the shock method not being called that in North America because in English, when we hear the word shock, we think of like electricity, which then had nothing to do with what was actually being done in the training.
Yeah,
as where with the Russian language, then maybe it makes more sense. And that wouldn't be the first time that something written in Russian that got translated over to English, there was like, I guess, some miscommunication or confusion because you're moving it from one language to another. I don't know if that's true or not, if that's why the coined term of plyometrics kind of happened here. And we didn't refer to it as the shock method because it actually had nothing to do with being electrocuted. So then we'd be like, well, this doesn't make any sense. Why are we calling it that?
Yeah, I mean, I buy that. I think that makes sense. The shock method being the name of it makes sense, I think, because it's like it's such an abrupt like impact, you know.
Yeah.
And like if you think about shocks in a car or a bike or whatever, like it's absorbing the impact, you know. So it makes sense to call it that. But I think when I have talked to people more recently about the shock method, they were like, I think I remember people being like, is that where you get electrocuted? Like, obviously it's not that. But.
Yeah, you jolt them with electricity and see if they're supercharged for the next movement.
Yeah. Potentiation. Nice. That's good.
But I thought that would be good just to clarify that we're probably going to keep calling it plyometrics because we're North American and that's the phrase we grew up on. But shock method is the same thing. So if you're reading anything from Verkhoshansky or, you know, a different part of the world and you hear shock method, that's what it is. It's the same thing effectively.
But yeah, so we're talking about, plyometrics with impact, like eccentric landing, impact to take off.
Yeah, the rebound.
Rebound, exactly. And we talked about on the last one, jumps where you don't do that are not plyometrics. At least not in this. Not
according
this
to the shock method.
Yeah.
Or it wouldn't fall under the category of the shock method.
Yeah.
Because there's no rebound action.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And so we were going to get into the adaptations first anyway. We talked about the stretch shortening cycle last time as the big one, but there's obviously a lot that comes with it. Yeah. So what do you think is the most important? Or do you want to go over the stretch shortening cycle again?
Well, I don't know. I was going to talk a little bit here about like the neurological function because I think the nervous system plays a big role in this as well, right? It's like we spent a lot of time in the last episode talking about like the muscle and the tendon, right? And the way that the muscle and the tendon interact with landing on the ground and then jumping back up, right? That the muscle tends to move a little bit less and it allows the tendon to stretch and react a little bit like an elastic band, right? You stretch it out, it has energy, and then you let go of it and it snaps back and
Yep.
gives you a bunch of like return in whatever direction you're going. But there's like a big neurological component of that as well, right? To allow the muscle to function. And so like Verkhoshansky highlighted some of the stuff, right? Like, you know, the coordination of firing of the muscle, right? And that has to come from the nervous system. So if someone's landing now on the ground and then jumping back up, you get this voluntary and involuntary action. So the involuntary action being the tendon, right? Like the tendon stretches, loads, and then snaps back. Maybe snaps back is not the right word because the tendon stays intact. Shouldn't explode. But that's like an involuntary action.
You're
It
not
loads
controlling it.
Exactly. It loads and explodes based on just the movement, as were the voluntary action of some of the propulsive force of the muscle contracting. That's what your brain, so if you drop off of a box and jump up, that's the part of your brain that's actively thinking about, oh, as soon as I touch down on the ground, I got to bounce back up toward the ceiling. And that obviously, if you train this method, it's a novel stimulus in some cases. So you need to practice pairing the voluntary and the involuntary action together upon the takeoff for the jump to actually make it the most effective. So there's a bit of a practice effect or a learning effect, which we've talked about in almost every training method that you're going to get. But I think it's important to highlight that because you wouldn't want to do this type of stuff with someone for a week or two and then you're like, oh, they're not getting it, and then just give up on it, because there is going to be a learning effect for them to figure out the timing of that.
Yeah, I think I did mention on the last one, maybe I didn't, but
Honestly, we recorded so long ago that
that's right.
I have a hard time remembering what we actually talked about in the last one.
And I mean, we released it a while ago, so maybe the audience forgot too.
Yeah. Hopefully.
Yeah. So with, there was a paper that I read that with like relatively untrained people, or like at least unfamiliar with jump training or this type of jump training, that prior to that like impact, there was a level of inhibition in like the ankle joint muscles, supporting muscles. I don't remember how high up the chain they measured, but yeah, there was inhibition. And then we talked about like the Golgi tendon versus muscle spindle, how it can kind of lead to everything relaxing so you don't hurt yourself. But yeah, I believe it was like 1 to 200 milliseconds that this inhibition lasted, to the point where you're not able to rebound at all because you don't have any activation when you hit the ground. Like you hit the ground and then now you're jumping, right? But over time, and you don't even need to be doing like the depth jumps, like the true plyometrics, like just the landing aspect of it can help like override the nervous system, or that aspect of it anyway, and like teach the nervous system to like pre-activate so that you're ready for the landing. And I imagine that if you are intentional with how you're trying to do that, then you'll speed that up. But the impression I got from the paper was that if you just like literally jump off of boxes, that will be enough to get this pre-activation going. So yeah, there's the learning effect, whether it doesn't necessarily need to be conscious, I think, but it's necessary for the nervous system.
Yeah, and I completely agree with that. Yeah, the pre-tension is probably where you're going to see that big difference, because if someone's not creating tension before they touch down on the ground, well, what did you say, a 1 to 200 millisecond window?
That's like the entire thing.
That's the entire, yeah. So if you're not prepared in that amount of time, well, that was the window of time you were afforded to do a true plyometric rebound, because it has to be so quick off the ground. So I think that's important to highlight because, yeah, if you're not prepared with tension before you hit the ground, well, you can't really use true plyometrics because you've lost that window of time.
Well, and it doesn't, yeah, and it doesn't allow you, if you're not pre-tensioned, it doesn't allow you to use the stretch shortening cycle at all because, like we just talked about, the muscle needs to be contracted for the tendon to stretch. And if you don't have activation in that muscle, it's not contracted. It's going to, like, your muscle will be fully stretched as soon as you hit the ground. And then the tendon doesn't get to stretch at all.
Yeah, because the length change in the unit of the tendon and the muscle, the length change is going to come from the muscle rather than the tendon, and then we lose. So yeah, I mean, yeah, that's it's important to look at that, like, sort of the learning curve, or it gives you an appreciation of why the learning curve is there. Like, because it's going to be true with any method that you use, that there's going to be a learning effect. But I think that nicely kind of highlights why there's the learning curve that there is that, like you said, someone has to learn how to develop pretension or preparing for contact on the ground before they can actually effectively perform this stuff. So, and if you know why that's the case, then it's easy. Like you said, you can do some depth landings and that'll help with that. And then you can go into depth jumps rather than just trying to, let's do this plyo. Oh, it's not working. Okay, this stuff doesn't work. And then you throw it out the window.
Yeah.
You never really gave it a real chance.
Yeah, that's right. Another potentially more neural adaptation that I found was increase force production in general. I did find, well, in a presentation, I think that Natalie Verkashansky gave based on Yuri's work, where she was talking about they found, I think it was between 55 and 75 centimeters was like the optimal height for depth jumps. And then whether or not that's the right range, it might be more like 40 to 60 or something like that.
Probably depends on the person.
I'm sure it does depend on the person, but wherever that optimal range is for the person, towards the lower end, she was saying more speed, that elastic rebound type stuff. And towards the higher end was more towards maximal strength type stuff. It's obviously very fast, short window maximal strength, but that was what they said. And then I found other papers that supported, depending on how you do your depth jumps. Like I did mention the one where they were trying to, like, one group was limiting the amount of knee flexion, so trying to have like all of the rebound happening at the ankle. And then the other group was trying to achieve a certain amount of knee flexion. It was 80 to 90 degrees. So getting pretty deep into it. And the minimal knee flexion group, so everything happening at the ankle, improved their like gastroc MVC a meaningful amount anyway. Where the other group did not improve it a meaningful amount. They weren't able to measure anything higher up the chain than, everything below the knee. But I imagine that they would have improved their knee flexor MBC if that was possible to measure. So that is another adaptation that you're going to be getting from it, depending, of course, how you coach the drill, how you set it up. But it's there to be had wherever you want it to be had.
Yeah, we can touch a little bit later on the specific, like some of the different ways you can train plyometrically to get different outcomes, but that goes back to like the neural output, right? Like you said, you're doing something at such a high level or a high intensity that you can improve, especially if you're on like a little bit of the longer side with the contact time, that you can really get the neural drive or the ability for the brain to create a lot of excitation in the muscles. You can really improve that ability with that type of work, right? Because then if you spend a little longer on the ground, the tendon's not doing quite as much work. So it's not as involuntary, it's a little more voluntary.
Right.
And that's where you can really get the brain to fire in a powerful way to give you an explosive movement in whatever direction you're trying to go.
Well, I think too, like, I mean, if you're measuring MBC, it's going to be an isometric contraction. If that's how you're choosing to measure like your force output, where a lot of the activity that the muscle is having is going to be an isometric contraction in these types of movements anyway. Um, and another, this was also in the presentation that Natalie had. It was hypothesized anyway that like why these things are so effective is because um, it like emphasizes the eccentric component so much more, because the eccentric is so much more aggressive because you're coming down into like this, like with speed into an impact. And like we talked about in the like the hypertrophy one, like there's so much more damage that happens and you're able to produce more force in an eccentric contraction.
Especially with the fast eccentrics. When we talked about that a little bit,
Yeah,
which this falls 100% in the fast eccentric
big time.
category.
Big time. So it was hypothesized that like the nervous system perceives an eccentric contraction as more of a threat, and if you're adding this much speed and force into it, it's even more of a threat. So that it actually, like there were like EMG studies to indicate that the brain like maps them or like prepares for them, or like the nervous system activates them differently than concentric contractions, which I found to be really, really interesting from like a just, yeah, like an output, like a neural learning kind of perspective as well.
Yeah, I would like completely agree with you on that one, that there's, yeah, the fast eccentrics bring so many potential benefits that you get that in this type of training. So then, yeah, the nervous system adaptations you get as a result of that are tremendous. And then on the other side, this um, I might sound a little bit confused with this because I'm not a neurophysiology expert by any means, but there was also talk about the Renshaw cells in the nervous system playing a role. And Renshaw cells are, I think they're kind of confusing and I can never remember exactly. I remember writing a little paper on my master's in this for one of the classes. It was like a seminar class since you had to pick a topic. And the person presenting, the prof, was a like neurophysiologist, and he looked at like inhibition work and things like that. And a Renshaw cell is I think it's a cell that inhibits an inhibitory cell. So it's like a double negative
So
type thing.
you want them to not get in, like if you have more of them or if they're more active, then you're getting less of the inhibitory response.
Yeah. So if we think about like movement velocity, right? And you want some muscles to be very active to help you move, and then you want other muscles to be unactive so that they don't create resistance in the movement. So the Renshaw cell, someone who knows physiology really well is going to tear me to shreds on that because I forget exactly how it works, but there was some sort of process with that when he talked about it in the seminar class. I was like, oh, well, if we could reduce the effect of that inhibition so we get more of the inhibition that we want and less of the inhibition that we don't want, that potentially could lead to a faster movement. And both Yuri and Natalia Verkhoshansky, I've seen work where they discuss the Renshaw cells and some of the adaptations that you get from this plyometric training, because there's cycles of times where things need to be relaxed and cycles of times where muscles need to be tense and producing contractions. So you get this learning or practice effect of this rebound activity of timing the inhibition in a better way. So that way, it's active when you need the pretension, but then it's not active when you need the ability to relax and just like float and project off the ground into the air. So again, I've probably butchered that in some way, but I know that there's some stuff I've read on the Renshaw cells that they play a role in terms of helping us with the like inhibitory aspects of plyometric training. But it was confusing, like double negative inhibits inhibitory. I've looked at the diagrams and like, this doesn't make sense to me. But if plyometric training helps with this neural pathway. That's all I need to know. Done.
It's good. Good enough. Good enough. Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense though. I mean, I don't understand. I think I saw something about Renshaw cells. I don't understand them either. But the idea that it helps with the whole inhibition where you want it, the ability to relax and contract intentionally and quickly, big time on board with that. I think it just comes with like the whole free fall aspect of it where like you can't be tense. Like you have nothing to be tense against. So you know what I mean? I'm just purely
You don't want to drop like a stone. It's not like you drop off the box and you just like squeeze everything as hard as you can.
Yeah, you'll never.
Like you want some things to be active, like you talked about, like the foot and the ankle, because you want to be prepared. But other things need to be relaxed in order to create that tension, and even more so on takeoff, because you want certain structures of the body to be active to help push you in the direction you're going, and you want other parts of the body to be inactive so they don't slow you down.
Yeah. And I think with certain athletes like that just don't understand how to do that, then like sometimes like I've had it with people that if they don't understand really where their like rib position is or their spine position, that like before I can tell them to do anything, it's just like, okay, first of all, put your chest up. That's easy. This is extension. Put your chest down. That's flexion / pretty close to neutral. Now you understand how to move your ribs and chest and spine. Now we can move on to stuff. And people that I like, they just have never relaxed really when they're doing something, like showing them something like this where you have to, like, you can't not relax. Then it's like, now I get it, So from a conscious learning perspective, I think there's value there as well.
I feel like you probably see that in powerlifting a lot. Everyone's just so tense and jacked up all the time because it's like it's a sport of tension.
Yes, which I mean that's fine. I don't have an issue with that.
Exactly.
But like as I'm working with like more athletes now, I see some kids that just don't know how to create any tension ever, and then some kids that can't let go of the tension. So
yeah, they're just like stiff and rigid, like robots moving around doing everything. You have robots and wet noodles, and you're like, I need something in between.
That's exactly what it looks like
Yeah.
sometimes. Yeah, that's good. The only other one that I came across was more structural, and tendon stiffness, purely tendon stiffness. And again, that's going to be dependent on how you're doing the activity. Like you can target more, like I said, this one where you're trying to limit the knee flexion, more ankle activity. They had a lot more Achilles tendon stiffness than did the other group. The other group had a little bit, but it wasn't really significant.
Did they do like an MRI scan or something? Was there like was there any structural change? Just out of curiosity, if they looked at that, because obviously like the tendon got stiffer, but was there like a structural change to the tendon that allowed it to be?
I don't remember how they looked at it. I have the paper saved, so I can check that when we're done here, and I can share it on the next one if that's of interest to people.
Yeah, no, I'd just be curious, like, because when we talked like in the hypertrophy one, like some of the structural changes that you actually get in the architecture of the tissue is kind of interesting. So I was curious to see if, like, is there a structural quality in the tendon that's associated with the stiffness?
Yeah, I mean
that would be kind of interesting to know.
That would be interesting to know. I don't know off the top of my head. I'm not sure how they quantified it. But I would imagine, like, I know the fiber direction when like tendons are healthier, generally speaking, or more elastic, then the fibers are going like parallel to each other versus all crisscrossy.
Yeah, you get like smooth lines in one direction versus like looks like an 8-year-old scribbled on a piece of paper.
Yeah, so if I had to guess, I would say it's more of that. But they were also talking like, I think depending on your activity, you like may or may not want more stiffness. Because like a stiffer tendon is going to be able to be loaded with more force and rebound faster, theoretically, but a less stiff tendon is going to require less force to be loaded, and you'll be able to store more elastic energy in it because it will be able to stretch more. So
Yeah, it's the trade-off.
I would imagine like more, like if you're a marathon runner, probably you would want more of the like stretchy tendon that can be, it doesn't require a lot of force to stretch, and you can store a lot of energy in it. And if you're a sprinter, you probably want it to be very, very stiff.
Yeah, it's like trying to
Is my
find the
guess.
happy medium, right? Like you don't
Yeah.
want this, you don't want your springs in your body, quote unquote, to be like, have you ever had like ever had like a coil over or a spring from a car in your hands?
No, I haven't. I'm not a
Like
car guy.
that thing it won't move. Like
Yeah.
it takes the whole weight of the car to move it. So
Yeah.
if your tendon's way too stiff, like you said, you can't load it with anything,
Hmm.
right? Versus you don't want your tendon to be like a slinky. You ever seen that? The spring thing that like
It
floats
just
down the
falls.
stairs?
Yeah, I
Yeah, and
love
it's just
that.
like it's like the wet noodle of springs.
Yeah, fusilli pasta.
Yeah, and so you don't want your tendons to be like that because then sure you can load them and stretch them and move in all kinds of different directions, but you get no like snap back on
Hmm.
the energy return. So that's a great point for you to bring up because you want to be somewhere in the middle,
Hmm.
like
Hmm.
loose enough that the tendon can store energy, but stiff enough that it can return the energy.
Hmm.
You don't want
Yeah.
to be a slinky.
No.
It's just, you know,
Yeah. And you don't want to be a steel cable either,
no,
or
because
like a,
then
yeah.
yeah, you can't load it at all. So
Yeah.
yeah, I think that's important to bring up, and that kind of goes nicely into like some of the different ways you talked about a little bit, like the ways that you can train
Hmm.
the plyometrics, because like some of the work that Verkhoshansky did initially was the jump training with like different loads.
Hmm.
I don't know if
Hmm.
you saw those
A
diagrams
little,
potentially.
a little bit, a little bit. I did see a bit where they were comparing like using more load at the same height, or the same height or same load, sorry, but changing the height of the jump.
Yeah, and then like they were discovering that you were getting different adaptations. So if you
Mm.
dropped off of a 1 foot box with no load, the movement velocity was very high. But then if you dropped off the box with even just 5 or 10 kilograms, it drastically slowed the movement. And then you were getting different adaptations because the time in which you were applying force was way different. So it was cool to kind of see. They were trying to see, okay, well, what happens if, like you said, we change the box height, we change the weight? Does that change the outcome? And that kind of led to like 3 different types of plyos, let's call it. I don't really know if the last one's truly a plyo because you're probably spending too long on the ground. But if you do like body weight unloaded jump or plyometric type activities, then it really focuses on like creating adaptation in the tendon. And you get more of that elastic recoil, I think is the word that Verkhoshansky used. So you can train for elastic recoil. You can train for the stretch reflex, which is kind of like a middle ground of you have a little bit of load, so it activates the nervous system a little bit more, but you're still spending a short enough time on the ground that you're getting the elastic recoil out of the tendon. And then you have like the pure CNS stimulus side where you're doing like a jump squat with like 30 or 40 kilograms, or dropping off of a box with like a higher load like that, where it's purely going to be this voluntary, like pushing or active type activity to get the brain to kind of fire. So you could potentially use different types of those uh, styles of training to get adaptations in different ways, depending on where either the sport or the activity needed you to go, or based on like where the person maybe has some weaknesses, and then you want to address a certain quality.
Hmm. Yeah, I did come across those three actually. Um, Here, and let me see. I'll pull up my spreadsheet quickly.
Oh, you have a
Where I
spreadsheet on this?
Well, just all my notes are on the spreadsheet. So,
Oh, okay. I thought you
because
had
yeah,
like a
no,
fancy
no,
spreadsheet prepared.
no, it's just the notes. But yeah, because I did come across those three, and I think I recorded more about the focus to achieve that kind of, like you're talking about, more like the heights and the loading.
Mhm.
But with the CNS activation, yeah, like you want to overload the eccentric was kind of the conclusion that I came to, or that they explained. For the stretch shortening cycle, focusing more on the timing and the rhythm of the jump, like not necessarily being fast, but feeling bouncy, like you're getting the energy back from the ground. Um, and then, yeah, and then the elastic energy recoil is obviously short ground contact time. Um,
Yeah,
just
I
trying to
tell
be
somebody the
quick off the
floor is
ground.
lava.
Yeah,
And it's like,
yeah,
just get off. Like the moment you touch down the ground, just get off the ground. Who
yeah,
cares how high you jump? Just get off the ground.
yeah, yeah. So those were, yeah, I guess a little bit more about how you would coach them rather than load it. But
Which is also great because, like you said, if you get somebody dropping off a box and you told them focus on jump height, I want you to drop off the box and get as high as you possibly can, they're going to have a bit of a longer contact time.
yeah,
And then they're going to jump higher. So you get more of that like CNS or nervous system overload versus if you tell them to just bounce off the ground immediately, like the floor is lava, then you're going to get more of the elastic kind of adaptation because you're going to be using the tendon more
yeah,
in that sense. So
and
it's great
even
because you don't necessarily need to add load per se. You could just change how you cue some of these movements to get a different contact time to get a different end result.
yeah, I mean, I think the impression I get from the CNS, or how they would do the CNS overload, is that it's more about the loading, I think, than the cueing. I know, like I do think that focusing purely on the height would give you more output, and so you probably would get like an adaptation more in that direction.
Might actually get you more in the middle ground now that I'm thinking
That
about it.
that's kind of what I was
Yeah.
thinking as well. I like I heard like a Darian Barr talk about like the rhythm of jumping and like redirecting the momentum. So that's how I kind of think about. He explained it, like the way he explained it was you focus on the timing of the jump so that you're pushing at the same time that the ground is pushing back against you, which is like, if you haven't tried to do it, it doesn't make any sense.
But when
But
you do it,
when I tried to do it, I was like, oh yeah, that's pretty cool actually. And I feel like that's like the rhythm of it is the stretch shortening cycle. Um, Versus with the CNS overload, I think it's just like jump from higher boxes, more load, like just hammer that eccentric force and speed and all that sort of stuff.
well, and even some of I think in the last episode you talked about, uh, I don't know if it's plyo and plyometrics or plyo with a Y and plyo with an I. I don't actually know
Yeah,
how to pronounce it.
I believe it was plyo with an I was the
Yeah.
eccentric action, or like eccentric. You just
Yeah,
call
but
it.
I can't remember. I don't know if it's actually pronounced like the same but spelled differently, or if it's pronounced like plyometric. I
Right.
no
Hard to
idea,
say.
but it's
Hard to say.
spelled plyo with an I.
Hmm.
And it was cool to see because both Yuri and Natalia highlighted some of the work that's been done in that realm where you get to see a little bit of like the training wasn't just doing like the depth jumps and like the pure plyometric activities. There was a whole bunch of other stuff that led up to it
Mm.
that focused on, like you said, the eccentric component. So like landing off a box with a bunch of load to prepare yourself for the landing and pushing against immovable objects. Um, like whether it was like this leg press type swing cart thing that then you could set it up so it didn't move and you just pressed as hard as you could into it, or something like that. But there was a lot of these like plyo with an I exercises that they did prior to this stuff, which was mostly eccentric and isometric based,
Mm.
which, like you said, is going to lead to that nervous system overload. It's going to get the brain to really have to be active and be in that like high threat level,
Hmm.
which I think in this case, maybe if we're talking about, are you training the elastic recoil? Are you training the stretch reflex? Are you training the nervous system? It's probably, like you said, more these activities that are nervous system and a longer contact depth jump would be maybe more stretch reflex.
Yeah. I mean,
Potentially.
a long contact depth jump is not that long anyway. So
Yeah, compared to an isometric action or an eccentric landing, right? Where,
well, just even other types of jumps that are more concentric based.
yeah,
But yeah, no, I got you. That's yeah, that's good. And I mean, the other, like, there's a lot of ways that you can modify these things too. But having those three in mind, I'm actually just a thought I had just now, because we've talked a lot about the contact time as being very important, and you want to probably, like, whatever the activity you're trying to improve, you want to get close at least to that contact time with your plyometric activities. Um, and I'm thinking that it it's not about the contact time, it's more about like these, well, it has to be more about these adaptations. And probably, like, in sprint performance, the CNS overload is not going to be as important, I would guess. Like, it would be very important as you're coming out of the blocks, which is going to be more of a strength focused activity. um, and the stretch reflex is going to be important as well, for sure, but the elasticity is going to be the most important thing, as it's a very short contact time activity versus like a longer contact time. um, like a high jump would be kind of in the middle, I think. And I haven't found any like really solid numbers on like a volleyball jump, but I think it's somewhere in like the 230 millisecond range.
yeah. So it starts to go above that.
Yeah, which would be more like CNS stretch reflex and less elasticity, I think.
Yeah, because you get more of that. You get more time to like load, like
Yeah,
actively load the movement rather than like passively load the movement through some sort of a free fall.
yeah. Which, I mean, they're like the last two steps. I mean, it depends how you do it, but the higher level jumpers, the last two steps are like a long. It's almost like a broad jump into a vertical jump. It's like a 1-2, so it's not quite. But it's not the same free fall because they're also loading like heel first, heel through to midfoot, and then jumping off of that. It's not like your midfoot striking and then bouncing, like it is in a sprint.
Yeah, well, and in sport, especially something like volleyball, because you have a set play, it would be more about getting the height that you need
Yeah.
to be able to attack the ball to put it in the opponent's court wherever it is. Like there's no time constraints on the offensive side. Defensively, you have to react in a short period of time. But
Yeah.
offensively, if I want to take an extra couple milliseconds to jump higher in a volleyball spike, I'm afforded that. That just means I have to change the timing with my setter and when the ball's coming up and whatever. But it's not like, oh, you didn't perform that spike jump in less than 2 milliseconds. That point doesn't count.
Yeah,
Like
that's right.
that doesn't exist.
That's right. And the only time you do have like the speed dependence, it's more of like a counter movement, like rate of force development jump anyway. It's still not elastic. So
Yeah. And that's where you see like in track and field, hurdles and sprint contact times are very small
yeah.
because it's time dependent
Yep.
versus long jump, triple jump, high jump tend to be on the longer end because there's no time constraints around the event. Well, besides you have a minute 30 to do your jump or whatever, I think by the
Right.
time the official says you can go. But if I spend a little longer on the ground because I have to clear the bar, jump higher into the pit, the officials don't then say, oh yeah, that doesn't count.
Yeah.
You were off the ground in too long a time frame.
Yeah. So then in those activities, you're trying to balance the amount of like speed and energy you already have with the amount of like force you can like produce and also like load up and use in that amount of time that you're on the ground without losing so much of that energy you already had going into that contact.
Exactly. Yeah, it's the balance of the two.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's nice because when you read that stuff, it gives you an idea of how to like maybe start to think about how to classify the exercises or organize your training, right? It's not just like, oh, we have depth jumps and that's it. Like there's things that you can do leading up to those more springy and reactive activities to prepare you. Like it's more than just one. Like training for plyometrics is almost more of a periodized plan or a process, as opposed to it is like when we talked about hypertrophy, it's kind of like it exists in one place within your training, right? Like it's, oh, we're going to dabble in some hypertrophy work, but there's not like, oh, we need to do A, B, and C to prepare ourselves to do some loading to failure or whatever. Is where like
I gotcha.
the plyos, it's nice that it's highlighted in this way, because you go, yeah, I need to make sure I've done some eccentric loading and probably have decent isometric ability, and I've worked on some of these other things prior to getting into it to make it more effective, as
Yeah.
opposed to just, oh, I'm going to drop plyometrics here in my program. Done.
Yeah. Well, and like some of the research that I came across too, like you can do, like you'll still get benefits out of plyometrics, you know, if you haven't, I mean, maybe, well, maybe not actually. The plyometrics that we're talking about, you'll get benefits from like jump training and speed training, you know, without having done these things. But if we're talking about like the true shock method, plyometric depth jump type stuff, then it is beneficial. You'll get more out of it if you have done some eccentric loading and some isometric stuff and like just strength work beforehand to develop more output, more like contractile ability. Because like we've talked about, if you're a wet noodle hitting the ground, like you're just going to splat and you're not going to bounce.
Yeah, exactly. Just splat. That's a great way of putting it. Just done.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So that's good. But yeah, it is good to keep those in mind. And then I guess like the study that I was talking about before with the focusing more on the ankle or more on the knee, that just kind of shows that you can direct those adaptations where you want them to go. Like, well, we talked about with track, obviously, especially if you're more of a longer sprint, like a 200, 300, 400, that's going to be more like a lot more dependent on your upright ability as opposed to the acceleration, compared to like a 60 is going to be more dependent on your acceleration, which I imagine is more knee dominant than it is ankle dominant, or more in that direction than like a 200 or a 300 would be more ankle dominant percentage wise, ratio wise.
Well, in this, like in the sense that, I mean, depending on how good somebody is, the 60-meter could be just a race where they accelerate the entire time.
Yeah.
Like someone like Bolt, he's been recorded as hitting top speed at 60, 70 meters into the race. So if he has a good run, it's possible he doesn't actually slow down at all in the 60. He just keeps building, and never actually. So the whole race is acceleration versus in 200. At some point, the velocity is going to start to come down. And like you said, you get that up and down. So the percentage of the race, which makes up acceleration, like you said, the longer the race goes, the smaller percentage acceleration makes up that race. And yeah, the more dependent you probably are on your upright ability to run, because you can compensate for it if it's a small part of the race.
So I would imagine like somebody that is more dependent on their upright ability, that's a better way of saying it than how I said it, would benefit more from doing more plyos focused around the ankle and stiffness in that area, versus a person who's more dependent on their acceleration would proportionally get more benefit. Like they would probably still get more benefit out of the ankle focusing on that because it is a very short contact time still, but they would benefit, I think, more than the upright person in spending time doing knee dominant plyos and focusing the adaptations in that area, compared to, and then even more so with like a volleyball jump, which is a lot more knee dominant, I think. So you would benefit even more from focusing your efforts on that stretch shortening cycle around the knee rather than the ankle.
And that's one of the takeaways that you can get from like the way that this shock method has been laid out, where exactly like you just described, okay, what's the sport? Who's the athlete? What am I dealing with? Oh, I need a little bit more of the nervous system focus because it's a longer contact time. So they have more time to apply force. That's probably going to help me versus, yeah, I'm working with a hurdler and they're on and off the ground in the blink of an eye. So I need to really focus more on the elastic recoil and that type of stuff. So I think, yeah, that does a great job highlighting that you, not all plyos, even that are, plyos, are necessarily the same. There's a way that you can do it a little bit differently to chase those different adaptations, and those adaptations will depend on your sport and your activity.
Mm-hmm.
But like you said, you don't just necessarily depth jump everybody and see improvement. You may want to do things a little bit differently or make a tweak here or there depending on what activity the person's actually going to do within their sport.
Or at least like you tailored the coaching of the depth jump to that kind of activity.
It's not a one size fits all.
That's right. I've also really been enjoying like combining different types of jumps to practice like the skill of redirecting force in different directions and things like that. Like one of my favorites is like a broad jump into a vertical jump and then into broad vertical. So like you don't have as much impact as you would from a depth jump because like you're probably not getting as high as the height that you're falling off of.
Yeah.
But landing from a broad jump is an impact and then redirecting that into a vertical and practicing, just redirecting that force and like using your momentum and putting it in different directions. I think A is a lot of fun and B, like it's a good skill to have because that's what sports are, is you use the energy you have to do the things you need to do. And like you're getting a lot of positive adaptation from it, depending again on the sport. Like if it's it's going to take more time on the ground to do those things.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be more strength dependent to do those things. But yeah, there's just another thing that I have been playing with, and I see value in it anyway, and it's fun. And just purely the direction of force that you apply is also another thing that you can change with these things too.
Yeah, you're just taking the concept of dropping on the ground and jumping up, where I could drop on the ground and jump to the side and then jump forward, or like you said, jump forward and then jump up, or it's all the same ability in the sense that you're rebounding off the ground in some direction. I imagine they kept it vertical in terms of like the work that Dr. Verkhoshansky did back in the 60s and 70s. I imagine they kept it vertical, A, because he was working with a lot of vertical jumpers, but then also B, it was probably easier to measure that way because it was consistent. Like the height of the box was measurable, the load was measurable. They were always dropping down and then jumping straight up. So you probably wanted some level of consistency.
Yep.
Because it was research work. So you needed, if you had people starting bouncing in different directions, it'd be more challenging to learn like the underlying concepts with so many changing variables. But I bet you now you could find more work on like elastic recoil and things like that in terms of changing direction on the jump. Like you said, a vertical to forward, or a vertical to the side, or forward to lateral, something like that.
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely much easier to measure. Actually, like earlier this week was the first time that I had anybody do like a depth jump into like jump off the box and then into a broad jump instead of a vertical jump.
Yeah.
And like you can skew your results so much by just pushing a little bit further forward off of the box.
Oh yeah, like you would need to almost go back and like take like if you had like markers on the ground and then this is where you started, this is where you.
But even still, you're carrying more forward momentum into it that way.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it's a nightmare that way. But yeah, and the other thing too is the more from what I've seen anyway, the more vertical, the shorter the contact time. Like a continuous, like a depth jump vertical depth jump is going to be a shorter contact time than a drop off a box into a broad jump.
Exactly. Yeah.
Continuous broad jumps are longer contact times than continuous vertical jumps.
Yeah.
And even like if you're doing the broad to vertical continuous that way, the transition from landing the vertical into a broad is longer than broad into a vertical.
Yeah.
So,
And again, that plays right into the, what are you trying to train?
yeah.
And some of the ways that, now that the initial work has been done with some of the research, like you said, now it's like, oh, it's easier to, okay, this is a little longer, this is a little shorter. So
Mhm.
that fits in here, that fits in there.
Mhm.
But so that's why I imagine they only did the stuff vertically, because they're actually trying to measure.
Yeah.
And they needed consistency to get the results.
That's
and now
probably
we can mess around with it and do different stuff, because
Yeah.
we, to the best of our current knowledge, we know what's going on.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's the, I'm sure that's the number one, but I remember you talking about too, like the contact time was very important for him and like the impact was very important for him. So I imagine that I mean,
It was
did
all
it for,
about the contact time. They were trying to
Yeah.
find training that mimicked the contact time in the sport. That's
Yeah.
ultimately what it, from what
So-
I understand, that
Mhm.
like that was the big driver.
Mhm. Yeah. So it worked out. It worked out pretty good.
I'd say so.
Yeah.
I'm glad they did it.
Yeah. Man, that was a lot of fun. I'm pumped for the next one. We're still
have
going to
part
talk about
3.
music. Yeah.
Yeah, but part 3 is going to be good. I'm looking
Yeah.
forward to it.
Even just like I was explaining to you at the beginning of this that I know you know more about this stuff than I know, and I'm just kind of getting into it. So I was like excited to kind of learn more about this stuff. But even just having a conversation about it, like everything that I knew before is clearer in my head now, which is nice.
It's always fun to talk about this stuff.
Yeah.
I'm enjoying, like, I guess we kind of stumbled on this by accident. Like the whole, like, let's do a 3-parter on something. Like it just kind of happened one time. And it's like, oh, all right, we'll do that again.
Yeah.
But like, I'm enjoying these 3-parters where we kind of like dive into some different stuff. And like, it's a lot of fun, and it's something I normally wouldn't do otherwise. So I think it's good either to go back and review some stuff that you haven't looked at in a while.
Mm-hmm.
Like I'd say most of the stuff I've done for this is a little bit more going back and reviewing. Because I've gotten away from a lot of this stuff. Even like at Waterloo, we did a lot of this type of stuff, and I do less of it now. And I'm like, I maybe shouldn't have got away from some of that stuff. So this was more review, is where like the hypertrophy one was a lot more like, let's explore some stuff that I haven't looked at. So I'm enjoying these 3-parters personally.
Oh yeah,
and
me
I'm
too.
enjoying them. So
it's just, like I said, I've been in the powerlifting world for a long time now, trying to get more into the athletics. So it's nice additional motivation, or like focused motivation to like, let's learn this now, instead of like, let's try to learn everything about, team sport athletes. Just focus. And it's a lot of fun. Also a lot of fun to talk about music.
Oh, always fun.
And it has been a while.
It has been. So you probably have a whole bunch of stuff loaded up. You're probably sitting on too much to share.
Well, I mean, I'll probably only share one thing so that I can save other ones for later.
Especially if the window of recording here is maybe narrower
a little
than the
bit,
last time, then you might want to hold on to something.
Well, actually, I've only been listening to one thing really since we last talked, and it was on your prompting. I listened to the Pop Punk Powerhouse playlist on Spotify.
Did you like it?
I did like it. I didn't like everything on there, but I did like it.
It's a mixed bag, but generally it's pretty good.
Generally it's pretty good, and it motivated me to compile my own pop punk playlist.
Nice.
So then that's what I've been listening to, and that's just, I feel like I've been like training for this now for the last like few months, because it's like, it's Machine Gun Kelly, it's Simple Plan, and then it's a bunch of like some of the old Madden soundtrack songs. So it's been a good time to listen to that stuff.
Yeah, the Pop Punk Powerhouse playlist on Spotify is like a big throwback. Like you get like some good Charlotte, Sum 41, like some bands that you're like, just a few songs you're like, okay, you know what, this isn't a bad tune. This is kind of fun. I can jam along to this.
Yeah, That's right. And then I was driving with my brother yesterday and like listened to some of his music, and that like re-inspired me. So I have a new a new inspiration to listen to
You're just on a
before the next
musical
one.
journey right now. I love
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's not a normal thing for me to be listening to music all the time. So it is. It's
I'm
nice when the
stoked for you, though.
inspiration actually comes. Yeah.
I'm
Thank
stoked for
you.
you.
Thank you. What have you been listening to, buddy?
I had a recommendation from a listener
Oh,
who I don't think they wanted me to say their name. If you did, let me know. I'll say your name next time. But they had sent me a tune. We got into a little like banter about songs of summer. And I said that the
okay.
greatest song of summer I think that was ever written was Get Lucky by Daft Punk, Pharrell Williams, and Nile Rodgers from summer 2013. I said that's
Okay.
probably the greatest song of summer ever
Okay.
written. But apparently, Blurred Lines by Robin Thicke and Pharrell that summer was more popular. So I guess it can't be the song of summer, whatever. So
Mm,
that sort of debate led to they sent me a song from 2017 by an Australian band called Parcels. Um, and this song called Overnight was actually produced by Daft Punk.
mm,
And dude, this song is so funky. It's so catchy.
mm.
It sounds like a song that belonged on Daft Punk's last album that they put out from that
Okay.
summer of 2013. Like
Sure.
I heard the first like 2 or 3 notes. And I was like, oh, Daft Punk 100% produced this song.
Mm,
It was so catchy. And then so I started listening to some of the other stuff by them, and they have this kind of like old school space funk disco kind of feel to them. Like they're a modern band. They're making songs now, but they should have been dropped in like the 70s or something like that.
mm.
And
That's cool.
it's really funky. It's really catchy. And I'm enjoying listening to a lot of that stuff right now.
Yeah, that's cool. Um, I will say that like one of my current like songs that I'm obsessed with is Summer Paradise by Simple Plan, which is like a nice, it's not nearly the same genre, but it's like a nice vibe. Just that you're mentioning summer anthems. Um, and there is a podcast that I've listened, it's a comedy podcast. The No Joke podcast is what it's called. And they have a couple of episodes where they go over like some of the most popular summer anthems, or they go through year by year what are the summer anthems and just talk about like what they remember about that song
So
being
yeah,
around or whatever. I can't remember exactly how they do it, but that's a fun one too. If you're in a debate, I guess you get
yeah,
another opinion there.
yeah. But no, I was glad I found like that they shared the song with me, because then I started listening to their other stuff.
Mhm.
All their other stuff isn't produced by Daft Punk, so to me it doesn't sound quite as good, but it's still really catchy, really funky, and like I have no problem listening to it.
Very
So
good.
it's worth checking out.
Yeah, right on. That was that was a good one, man.
We're having
Um,
fun with this.
yeah.
I'm having fun with this, and I want to speak on your behalf.
Well, I'm having fun with it
Okay.
too, and I'm excited. I feel like to be back in the rhythm of doing it again, because we were kind of like hit and miss here for a
Yeah.
little bit.
Yeah. I'm glad that we're back in the shop.
Yeah. So yeah, if anybody's got any questions or comments or wants to rip us apart because we don't know what the shock method is or neurofizz or whatever,
Renshaw cells.
Renshaw cells, let us know on Instagram, Speed Strength Show, Speed Strength Performance, or Braden Southern, and we will, I don't know, wilt at your knowledge or have a witty retort, something like that. Yeah, and until then, that was the Speed Strength Show. Thanks for coming along, world.
We'll see you next time.
Peace.